Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Pulse of the Parish podcast. I'm Arthur Eve, and in this episode I sit down with the 2020 Louisiana Teacher of the Year, 2020 National Teacher of the Year Finalist, and the author of the book The 1868 St. Bernard Parish Massacre, Blood in the Cane Fields, Chris Dier. We talked about Chris's Teacher of the Year experience, his 2020 experience so far, the resurgence in interest in his 2017 publication, and some other pressing social matters. We had originally recorded video for this episode, but lost footage due to a corrupted memory card, so this episode will be all audio. It will also be available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms.
So my name is Chris Dier, and I'm a history teacher at Ben Franklin High School. I'm from St. Bernard Parish. Wow, this is fancy. This is the fanciest podcast.
Oh yeah?
I feel like I'm on Joe Rogan already.
Yeah, that's when I first started doing podcasts maybe 5 years ago, and it was because of his show that kind of put me into that.
Yeah?
Just because I like long form content. I'm not a big fan of small blurby.
Yeah, I think that's why it does so well, right? It's kind of an antithesis to this sensationalized like clickbait pieces and whatnot, and he'll like have someone on for like 3 hours. And
You really get to
feel for the
extrapolate an idea and get.
Yep.
So, all right, Chris, welcome to the Pulse podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I know you're doing kind of a book tour, virtual book tour, but then you're also doing the National Teacher of the Year. What's all that?
Yeah. So I wrote that book in 2017.
Yeah.
And when it first came out, I did a lot of speaking engagements at different museums. I had the book opening at the Preservation Resource Center in New Orleans, and I spoke at the Mint and did book signings at coffee shops and whatnot. And that sort of died down a bit.
Yeah.
And then I was selected as Louisiana Teacher of the Year, and then National Teacher of the Year finalist. So I didn't get National Teacher of the Year, but I was a finalist.
Yeah.
And then I think my work started to have somewhat of a resurgence, especially considering the issues that are going on now.
Right.
So now people want to revisit the topic.
Right on.
Yeah.
We'll get to the book in a second, but I'm curious what sorts of things go into this designation, National Teacher of the Year finalist.
Yeah, it's an incredibly long process. So at first I was voted Teacher of the Year at Shelman High, which is a great honor, right?
Right.
Your peers actually pick you. And then the district, St. Bernard Parish School District, they send you to the state level.
Right.
And you do their application, which is, consists of a series of essays and teacher videos. I think one of them is on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And then they pick 24 people as semifinalists. And then you do things even more essays, more videos and whatnot. And then they pick 9 finalists, and then they narrow it down to 1. So so it was a long process. And then when I was Louisiana Teacher of the Year, you have to do an application for the national level. And there's about 57.
So it's kind of connected.
Yeah. So there's about 57 people that apply, all 50 states and territories, and the Department of Defense sends a teacher as well.
Mm.
And then from there, they pick 4 finalists for National Teacher of the Year.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I know I've seen your calendar on your website.
Okay.
You've got a series of interviews coming up, or just one big interview coming up.
Yeah. There's multiple. There's a lot of interviews, and it makes for a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But I have an interview tomorrow with YES. That's going to be with Superintendent Cade Brumley, so I'm excited about that. I think that airs on Thursday. I can double check all of that. But yeah, so I'm always trying to do interviews, and people always want to hear, well, here's an issue about education. What does the Louisiana Teacher of the Year say about it? So happy to give my voice and uplift teachers whenever possible.
Very cool. Sorry, then let's talk about this book of yours, the 1868 St. Bernard Parish Massacre, Blood in the Cane Fields. It's a pretty evocative title. Where's the source of this? Not the content, but the title itself.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the events in 1868 were considered a riot at the time. That was the word that was used, St. Bernard riot. But some documents and some black newspapers called it a massacre. And so from the start, I saw that it was already politicized. You know, uh, two different words for the same event. And I thought about the differences between a riot and a massacre. And obviously, it wasn't a riot. There wasn't, two sides just
Attacking each other.
chaotically. Yeah, yeah. It was one side. It was very orchestrated and whatnot. So I went with the term massacre. I thought that was more accurate. And Blood in the Cane Fields is a title that the subtitle that I thought of because I kept reading about how people would try to escape to the cane fields.
Mhm.
And then if they were caught or found, it would end really badly. And I also wanted to pick a title to let the reader know it's not going to be this, fun, loving history book. It's not going to be, this feel good and have this amazing ending. But it's a serious topic, and a lot of people were killed, and I wanted the reader to know from the title the severity of the situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
And so that's kind of why I went with that title.
certainly.
Yeah,
Kind of as a history teacher, you understand that history is kind of taught by those who are in power or those who've won the battle, as they say. But it seems like you've come at it from a different point of view, from a from the point of view of those who didn't win.
exactly. And I think that's what makes history so fascinating. If
Yeah,
you look at it from different lenses and perspectives, and not just the people that are in power that created the narratives.
right,
What about the people who were not in power at the time? Or if you study things like the Holocaust and whatnot, um, you should definitely read literature by Jewish people
right,
and by different groups that were harmed, and their lens and perspective in order
right,
to gain a way better understanding. And I think it's the same in U.S. history, right? Like, what were these
100%.
people doing? What were these groups doing? So that's why I really wanted to, focus on the victims and how they survived and how they thrived, and put that different lens on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what led you to write this book in the first place?
Interestingly enough, I didn't know I was going to write a book about it. I was reading about St. Bernard Parish and reading history.
Mhm.
I was teaching Louisiana history at St. Bernard Middle,
Right.
and I was reading this book called Reconstruction in the Cane Fields by a local author, John C. Rodrigue, a historian guy taught at LSU. And in one of the footnotes, it said in 1868 there were disturbances in St. Bernard Parish. And I said, that's fascinating. What kind of disturbances? And I looked at his, sources, and then from there, which were like historical government documents, and then from there, I kind of just dived into it.
Yeah.
And once I saw something of that extreme nature that happened that I didn't know about, and
Right.
I'm a history teacher. My mom was a history teacher. She didn't know about it. And it turns out only literally a handful of people knew about this. People that knew about it through oral history, or historians like Bill Highland that are around here that study everything. So I actually started off with a blog. I wrote a blog about it
Okay.
and just put it out there. This was 2013, 2014. And it gained a lot of traction because a lot of people were invested or interested. They didn't hear about it. And then I started writing other pieces of history as well,
Mhm.
like the 1891 lynchings of Italians that happened in New Orleans, one of the biggest mass lynchings in our country, and just a lot of different events of that maybe didn't make it into the textbooks or people don't know, but
Mhm.
still might find fascinating. And the history press reached out and said that they saw the article about the St. Bernard Parish Massacre, and they asked if I'd be interested in writing a book about it. Well, by the time they reached out, I already had so much information and resources and whatnot. So I happily obliged, and yeah, and I just started, cranking it out
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
as much historical context as possible. And uh, yeah, so from there, I just really wrote this book, and um, seems to be well received. I mean, people are hungry for this history. So
Well, certainly.
yeah, yeah, I'm happy I did it. Yeah.
You've got a very I don't want to say insular, but a
Mm,
very specific, very niche area down here. It's
mm,
like not New Orleans, but it's not, the country.
right.
So you've got a very specific
Yeah.
crowd here, and then you've also got connections throughout the country of people that would be interested in this sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sampano Parish has an incredibly unique history.
Yeah.
Unique people down here. So many different groups lived here, from the Isleños to Cajuns even came down here. First Filipino settlement. Rich Black history in the parish. So it's a really interesting, fascinating place. So people here are into history anyway,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I have that, and then I have people around the country who are into Reconstruction history, which was the era at the time, and people who are into Black history and whatnot. So yeah, it's got a wide audience.
Yeah. Where does the subject matter of the book start?
Yeah, so I first start with a guy by the name of Lewis Wilson,
Mhm.
who I zoom in on this one guy who kind of fascinated me throughout, because he at the time was in New Orleans and he was coming back to St. Bernard Parish, had no idea what was going on, and obviously he came back in the midst of a massacre.
Mhm.
They take him off of his horse and they throw him in this makeshift prison, and then they try to execute this guy. Well, Lewis survives the execution. He crawls into some bushes, and then they try to, kill him point blank. They shoot him again.
Mm.
Then he survives that, and then he gives his testimony.
Mm.
And I just found it absolutely fascinating that this person survived all of this, and then to actually give his testimony and whatnot. So I wanted to highlight somebody. And then I go and give the historical context of St. Bernard Parish, because you
Right.
can't understand the race relations if you don't know the groups that came.
Right.
And
You don't have a vast idea of the environment in which all of this is taking place.
that's exactly right. You need to have that additional layer, and
Mhm.
some people in the parish might already know the names and the groups and the people and whatnot, but anybody outside of St. Bernard Parish, as Leños might mean just a Spanish word, or um, Creole. What does that mean? And so I try to give as much context as possible. So like the first two chapters are just straight context about
Yeah.
the area.
Yeah.
And then it goes all the way up to 1868, and then that's when I really get into those events.
Yeah. What was the political environment like at that time?
Yeah. So in the 1860s, obviously the Civil War happens,
Right.
and then after the Civil War, Louisiana is under federal occupation during Reconstruction. And at this time, you have black male suffrage, so black people can vote.
Right.
And St. Bernard Parish was a parish where the majority of people were black because of slavery.
Right.
And now you start to see the political landscape changing a bit. So the Democrats were in power at this time, and that was the party back then that was the most. They were, white supremacy was their thing, keeping
Right.
white people in power.
Right.
Obviously, things are a lot different. It's almost, when you say Democrats and Republicans, almost like forget everything you know about right now, because
Yeah.
there's just so much has
Well,
changed.
there's yeah.
And
I have a whole. I've talked about this so many times.
yeah,
The historical context of
Mm.
Democrats and Republicans, and then how they're really the same party, and they had a
yeah,
small difference in opinion, which
yeah.
is what broke them apart. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, and yeah, it's fascinating because sometimes I talk about the political parties of the 1860s, and partisan people today would be like, those dang Democrats. And I'm like, well, it's a lot different. It's not like they
Actually.
kept their 1868 platform,
Yeah.
for today, or vice versa,
Right.
Republicans as well. But places like St. Bernard Parish started to lean Republican, and that was big trouble for the powers that be, for the former slave owners, for the wealthy business community of the South, the agrarian interest. So they wanted to launch a campaign of voter suppression
Mm.
to stop Republicans from getting into power. Well, if you stop the black vote, then you can stop Republicans from getting into power. So they launched that campaign of voter suppression, and it was very successful. And if it didn't go the way they wanted, then they resorted to violence. That was the obviously what happened in St. Bernard Parish, but also in Opelousas and Bossier City. So it happened all across Louisiana and across the South in 1868. But essentially, it was between two candidates: Ulysses S. Grant, he was this famous Union war hero
Right.
on the Republican ticket, and the New York City mayor, Horatio Seymour, maybe governor, but he was from New York, but he was a Democrat, and he
Mm.
called himself the white man's candidate, and said that he was going to do away with Reconstruction and bring the South back to home rule. which a lot of historians call white supremacy. You're going to put the old slave owners back into power
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
different groups. So wealthy white people had a lot on the line for that election, and that's why things turned so violent because they were really amping up all this,
Yeah.
chaos to try to get Seymour elected. So it was. I know people think politics today are wild and whatnot, and they are, no doubt about it. But back then also
Yeah.
was incredibly intense. So yeah, it was a fascinating time.
Yeah. Most of what I know about this book,
Mhm,
I learned from you during our class, our leadership class. Um, and it's fascinating. I mean, we've ordered a book to read ourselves, just so we get an idea of what's
mhm,
the some of the things down here. I know a lot of the names of the streets and of the areas are named after the the folks from both the Free Black Men's group and from the those who were people in power at the time.
mhm.
What sorts of ideas do you want to produce in the minds of the people who read this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. First, I want people to get informed as much as possible. I truly believe that you can't understand things that are happening today,
Mhm.
especially race relations and issues of that nature, if you don't understand the history of your own country,
Right.
especially things that happened in your community. So hopefully, there can be more education to be had, and then from there, this is kind of what we do in history class, right? We want people to get educated in terms of different things that happen in history, and there hopefully action can come about, whether
Right.
it's thinking about how you view our country in terms of if you're a patriotic person, then you want to embrace all of it and try to make it better.
Right.
And I think understanding history can do that. And some tangible things that I hope to come out of it. I hope eventually there's a monument maybe for the victims, or something that can say like this happened,
Mhm.
and then as a community we can grapple with it and try to understand it on a level of reconciliation and moving forward and trying to understand our history. So in my mind, the more you understand education or history, the more educated you are about that, then the more likely you'll be to understand the struggles of other people and what they went through. And hopefully, it might instill a desire to do something about maybe contemporary struggles because it's still not over, right? It's
Right.
not like it ended after slavery or after the civil rights movement or
Right.
things like that. It's things still continue. And in order to understand that, you have to have an understanding of the past.
Yeah. Well, it seems we've kind of alluded to it, but it
Mhm.
seems the timing of your initial release of the book
Mhm.
is pretty coincidental with things that are going on in the modern. Is this a coincidence? Was it brought up by things that had happened in the news or politically or socially around that time?
Yeah, good question, because I can say personally for me, it was purely coincidental.
Mhm.
I happened across the story. I wasn't out looking for, massacres and said, I'm going to try to
Yeah.
find one
Yeah.
and write about it. Just so happened I came across one that happened in my hometown. So for me, it was coincidental, and and it tying in with different things that were
Mhm.
happening at the time. For the history press, I'm not entirely sure. I think that they sensed that people were hungry for this type of history, and they started, reaching out to people who were already invested in it. So I think for them, it was probably more calculated. Like, here's a guy who wrote about a massacre that happened that people don't know about, and it does tie into things that are happening today with Black Lives Matter and social justice issues. They also reached out to someone else who wrote a book about the Thibodeau massacre
Okay.
that happened as well. So around the same time, our books came out around the same time. So I think they were probably reacting to things that were going on at the time, and people being hungry for this history. Because if you think about Reconstruction history, it's almost not in the curriculum, or at least up until late. I didn't know much about it until college, and I was a history major, and the way that they would talk about Reconstruction as this just monumental shift in our country's history, but was so absent in my own, mind,
Right.
that I didn't know much about. Um, for me, coincidental. I was just researching my own what happened in my backyard. History Press, they probably saw that people were interested in. I don't
So
know. I can't speak on their behalf
I
though.
can, yeah, no, I get that. I get that. That's cool. Tell me about your thoughts on the conversations going around about the monuments and the spaces that are named after uh, white supremacists.
Yeah, interestingly enough, being from Sampano Parish, you hear about Beauregard and P.G. Beauregard, the Confederate general who was responsible for firing the first shots of Fort Sumter.
Hmm.
And there was a Beauregard High School, later became Beauregard Middle. And we have streets named after white supremacists. Leander Perez, notably, Judge Perez Highway, literally right there. I know that switched in '99, but that was the original name intention. And I just grew up with it and didn't think much about it. I went to Andrew Jackson High School, who he obviously owned people and was in charge of legislation that led to genocide and whatnot. And so when you grow up in that environment, it becomes normalized and you don't really think about it
Yeah.
because no one's having those conversations. I never heard
No.
anyone say or talk about that growing up. It wasn't until I went to East Texas Baptist University or went to undergrad and started studying history that I started to see, additional perspectives and different layers and then having conversations and then moving back to St. Bernard Parish and unraveling some things in our own history that I remember starting to not even second guess for the first time analyze my surroundings in terms of what things are named after. So in my mind, I think these are these are productive movements to try to not rewrite history, but to make it right. Because
Right.
the people who built the statues and the people who named the streets, Jefferson Davis Highway and whatnot, essentially they were naming things that already existed, and they were scratching those names and putting these names up. So personally, and I know that I might be an anomaly in around St. Bernard Parish with this, but I think that statues that glorify white supremacists or street names that are named after white supremacists should definitely be more representative of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I think that that's the trajectory that our society is going.
Yep.
So I think people are starting to have a lot more of these conversations, which is good. And I also think that's not just because of everything going on today. People are getting a better understanding of history and
History.
yeah, why
Get a
these
more
things
nuanced idea of what's going on. I know
exactly.
the fight over the monuments in New Orleans is rather heated at the moment.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've been very successful though. The Take 'Em Down NOLA group and whatnot. They removed many. The mayor, Landrieu beforehand.
Mm.
He, in coordination with them and different groups, I know they removed the Jefferson Davis statue, Robert E. Lee, the Beauregard one, and the one that was celebrating the Battle of Liberty Place and whatnot. So, yeah, and I think that those conversations are going to trickle elsewhere.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, it kind of seems like they've already started to move their way up into DC and the Washington area.
yeah.
Um, what is your how do you feel about taking those monuments and then putting them into like museums?
Yeah, I went to a museum in I don't know why I can't remember what city it was, but it was in the Northeast. I want to say Indianapolis, and they had a bust of Adolf Hitler's head.
Mhm.
That was something that was in his bunker, and I remember seeing it and just like hurt, like feeling what, like I could not believe I was seeing something like that.
Yeah.
But it was in a museum, and you got to see it in that context,
Yeah.
and you get to read about it, and you get to understand it, and whatnot. And so I think that having something like that in a museum, I'm not sure how people might feel about it,
Yeah.
but I think that that's a much better place for it than on the corner of, when you're going into City Park and you see Beauregard on the, horse in full Confederate regalia marching into battle
Oh,
with a
100%.
cape and
Yeah.
stuff and whatnot. So I think a museum would be a much better place for some of these statues than out there.
Yeah.
Especially if you can give some historical context and
Yeah.
understanding of
I
um,
think the understanding where people were
mhm,
mentally at that time and the type of things that they were trying to do. Especially, I know a lot of the Confederate statues were raised long after the end of the Civil War
Yeah, yeah.
and made out of inferior materials that aren't
Mm.
meant to last forever.
Yeah, yeah. Some of them, all the way up until the civil rights movement, they were still building statues, and you saw that in the early 1900s. After they sort of solidified Jim Crow, they
Hmm.
started putting a lot of money into these statues, and it was definitely there to make a statement. This is the people that you should glorify, and the people that they harmed are the people that you should not. And so they had an agenda. The people who created them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I find it fascinating the way you use historical information uh, to explain modern day policy and social happenings and things. I
Mhm.
know I read your blog. One of your blog posts was bringing up the history of axe versus ask.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
I found that fascinating. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Chalmette, and
Yeah.
you can probably still hear some of the accent. I didn't lose it completely. But I also played soccer in Lakeview,
Mhm.
and I was the only kid from Chalmette, only kid that went to public school and whatnot. And my dad drove like this really old Ford Aerostar van, and all these other kids pulled up in, fancy cars and whatnot. And I noticed that I was the only one who talked differently, and they would bring it up and
Mhm.
they would say, "Why do you say ask like that? Why do you?" And they would ask me these questions, and I would go home and tell my parents, and I'd be like, "What? Why do I? What's the difference?"
Yeah.
And my mom would just say things like, "That's just how we talk," and that's it.
Yeah.
And then, but
Yeah.
when I started studying linguistics or history and came across different things, I started to learn that it's actually much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And the way that I was speaking wasn't wrong, it was just different.
Different.
Yeah, and that's when I
Just
started
unique.
unique, yeah. Yeah, I like that word better. So that's when I started studying it and trying to figure out why did I say, "ax," instead of "ask," and I came across these different, studies and blogs that show that it's actually not improper, but it's a derivative from the word axiom, which means to inquire or to ask, that was used by like Chaucer and in certain editions of the Bible and by a lot of people in the English speaking world.
Yeah.
And then ask became preference, but still some communities, like working class white communities, black communities, especially in Louisiana, still went with axe. So I found that to be really fascinating. I mean, so many things like making groceries instead of going to get groceries.
Yeah.
And that's something we said growing up, and I never.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, that comes from the French word to make. Well, in Spanish, it's hacer, and it means to make and to do.
Yeah.
The French word starts with an F. I would probably butcher it if I pronounce it, but it means to make or to do. So when Louisiana transitioned from a French speaking um, territory, especially down here in Sampano Parish, to an English speaking place, then some of the things didn't transfer
Yeah.
the best.
Yeah.
And make was a word that in French and Spanish, you have that verb that means to make and to do. And then in English, you don't have that verb. So when we were say that we were doing something, we kept using the word make as well. And it's still stuck till the 21st century.
That's
So
fascinating.
yeah, man, I remember learning these things and I'm just like, wow, I just thought we were speaking improper and
Improper. Yeah.
yeah, but not the case
See,
at all. It's historically based.
part of the reason I bring it up is because growing up, I've heard many of my friends use that word,
Mhm.
and I would kind of make fun of them, say, "Oh, that's dangerous. You're gonna ask me something."
Yeah.
Um, but then later on, I've gone out to Italy, and when I got back, I tried to start learning the language, and I found, uh, nah, I can't remember the word right offhand, but
Mhm.
the equivalent of
Axiom?
axiom,
Yeah,
axiom.
yeah, yeah.
There's there's a Latin word
Mhm.
that is essentially the same thing, and
Oh,
so
really?
that kind of spurred my mind into looking at the etymologies of words
Mhm.
as I'm learning them and as I'm having conversations with folks, both so that I get I mean, you can get the dictionary
Mhm.
version of the word, but then you can also get the historical where the word came from originally, and you get a much more nuanced idea of
Right.
what these words mean, both, the redundant version of the word and the more modern version of the word. So I find
Yeah.
I find all of this fascinating.
I think traveling helps with that as well because if you go places, you start trying to understand why people say different things,
Yeah.
and then when you talk to people in different countries, they'll talk about all the differences in their own countries and whatnot, and then come back to the states, and then you start looking at things in a different lens. But yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. There's so many words that we say down here that I would try to not say growing up. Like
Yeah.
when I went to college in Texas, I'm not going to say, and I would think about things that I would say and how I would say them. Even water, like I would avoid saying that completely. Just try to say like H2O or something because
Yeah.
the moment you say it, people are like, "Whoa, that's can't believe you
Oh yeah.
talk like that,"
Hey, where are you from? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you go through this whole spiel again. But then once I started studying, yeah, linguistics and the etymology of words, I started to feel more pride
Yeah.
in this way, and started to not try to hide my accent as much, and maybe code switch, talk a certain way to certain people, and then talking to friends and family how I feel, comfortable and
Yeah.
whatnot. And it makes for an interesting, yeah, discussion.
I think it's I think it's great in that you give the opportunity for somebody else to learn something
Mhm.
in a conversation that seemed trivial or minor. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it makes it more. It gives more complexity to he's not just saying it wrong, or he's not
Yeah.
just he's and I try to tell it to my students too,
Yeah.
because if you make them feel unique, then and if you bring their culture into the classroom, then
100%.
they tend to own it more. They
Yeah.
say, "What? Why?" And they say "buku," and I was like, "You know what language that's from, right?" And they no, that's just what we grew up saying. I'm like, "You're literally using a French word."
French. Yeah.
Yeah, and they actually found that pretty surprising. So
Yeah.
yeah,
You tie history to identity and
yeah.
you get interest. So kind of speaking of school, going forward with the 2021 school year, I know the news just came out that the year is going to start uh, all virtual. How are you feeling about that?
So you're talking about the news in New Orleans or St. Bernard
In New
Parish?
Orleans,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So, 'cause I know
Although
St.
I
Bernard
figure
Parish.
St. Bernard Parish, you usually follow suit after a moment. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, sometimes. In New Orleans, when they came out with that decision to go virtual, I could finally breathe, and I could finally sleep better at night, and I could finally, start to try to plan the lessons that I had and make them more virtual,
mm,
because when you don't know what the situation is gonna be, it's hard to plan and prep.
yeah,
But I think virtual is probably the best case that we can do at the moment. It's the safest.
yeah,
If we don't, then and if the experts are correct, and they've been correct, then people will die. I
yeah,
don't know how else to say it.
yeah,
Teachers, vulnerable positions, or with immune issues, even some students, and it would increase transmission to the community. So I think virtual is a good decision because at the end of the day, teachers, we're worried about our safety for sure.
mhm,
But at the same time, this has happened in our country many times. If somebody walks in with a gun to do a mass shooting, we do a lot of training on what to do, but we all will take a bullet for a student that walks to the classroom. It's just something we think about, like that's what we're going to do. But what I'm not sure I'm prepared to do, and I don't think we should be asked to do this, is to go into a situation, an environment where we could potentially contract COVID and then spread it elsewhere, or get it and then spread it to our students, or something happen to the nature where a student gets it and they go home and then they spread it to their parent or grandparent or guardian or whoever, and then that student loses their support structure, right?
yeah,
So I think that's where teachers draw the line, because teachers have put up with a lot, but then when you're asking us to put not just our lives on the line, but the lives of our students and their families, and then our families and people in the community,
yeah,
then I think teachers are kind of, wait a second. So I think virtual is a good call, at least until things become more
yeah,
contained.
yeah. I know we had a one of our guest speakers for one of our events, Dr. Kelly Peterson for New Orleans Public Schools
Mhm.
had we were talking about the last year's use of virtual teaching and then how that would go moving forward. And one of the issues she mentioned was that a lot of kids don't have the technology and things to support that teaching structure. Do you know if like the 2020 school year will be any different, or if things have been made more available?
Yeah, it's a good question because we knew that there were a lot of inequities in education
Yeah.
well before the pandemic happens. The pandemic starts, and all of a sudden they get exposed to the wider world. But many of our students and our communities, they already knew that they were lacking in certain resources, and teachers also in certain schools were lacking in resources. So you saw that gap be sort of spotlighted and highlighted throughout the entire country.
Yeah.
Some students some schools can transition much easier because all their students have laptops. When I was teaching at Shaman High, that was not the case. So it was kind of a scramble to get students laptops. Or if they had a laptop, I had one student who literally had one laptop and five siblings.
Ah,
And so how do share that? She could only be on at certain times. So I'd have to call her and give her lessons and whatnot. And this was for quite a few students. Um, I think this upcoming fall, schools and districts are more prepared for virtual learning than they were back in March when everything shut down. But at the same time, those inequities are definitely going to exist. Virtual learning is going to be really challenging for many teachers, many students, and some students are going to fall behind academically. And it's unfortunate. And the only way teachers will take that hit is if it's gonna prevent and save lives.
yeah.
So that's kind of the only, um, way that you can rationalize that because you don't want any kids to fall
Oh, of course
behind.
not.
Yeah,
No.
teachers don't we get into the classroom because we wanna teach and be with our students and engage and interact and, create this lively environment of learning. That's
Yeah.
the goal. Those are the visions we have in our mind. And virtual learning is just not that.
Yeah.
It's not it's not fun. It's much harder to virtually teach than it is to teach in the classroom because some people were under the impression that we were gonna, be chilling from in our homes and just speaking to cameras and whatnot. But it was much harder. It's much harder for me to teach virtually than in a classroom.
Yeah. I think people severely underestimate the amount of learning that happens through um, nonverbal versions of communication. Yeah,
Exactly.
I totally get that.
Yeah, because we have to read students' faces. We get to see, the emotions that they bring in. They get to see our emotions, and hopefully, we're excited about the content and whatnot. And virtual learning kind of takes that connectivity and creates a barrier
Yeah,
between it. So it's yeah, it's really tough to do.
yeah. Cool, man. That's really all I have left. Is there anything that you could think of that you would like to say to the St. Bernard Parish or greater New Orleans area community?
Let's see. Anything that I'd like to say to St. Bernard Parish, Greater New Orleans area community? Keep learning our history. We have a unique history down here, and the more we bring that to light, I think the more we can come to better understandings and work through issues that we have going on today. So I guess that would be something that's just popped in my head as we were speaking about things earlier.
Cool. Well, thank
Yeah.
you, sir.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to talk about these issues and stuff. And thanks for bringing it to light. It's very important.
But yeah,
That,
no,
yeah.
the way that you talked about it was so entertaining, and so I thought
Oh,
we need to spread this out as much as possible. Get this in front of as many faces as in front of as many eyes as possible.
I agree. I agree. So yeah. So I appreciate you giving me this opportunity.
Of course.